that by meeting myself where I'm at, no matter how I'm feeling, no matter what's on my mind, and learning how to be more at peace with the way things are this moment, still understanding that I would like to change things and create a new outcome, but the current reality is this reality. Kia ora whānau, welcome. It's Kieran Headley here, and I have something special for you today. Firstly, it's surely been a minute. I'm currently living in Bali, and I felt to share a couple of questions and some solutions I've come to those questions that are ruminated on for many years. So as many of you may know who have watched or listened to my stuff so far, you know that I really suffered anxiety for many years. In fact, if you follow me on Instagram, you would have seen some of my videos I reshared from 2017. The pace that I operated at is otherworldly. I have no idea how I managed to fit so many words into a 15-second story on Instagram. It's insane, right? So the pace that I'm at is like 4 times slower. And these two questions that I ruminated on for a long time were, what is anxiety? And why is it there? Now, after the many years of trying to figure myself out, going to therapy, doom scrolling Instagram, right? Trying to find the answer through other people. I finally started to learn more about the brain. So I started studying neuroscience. In fact, I'm currently studying biomedical science, minoring in neuroscience, which has been incredibly helpful to help me understand the flip side to that, which is the years I've spent learning from monks. 2 of the main monks whose names I do know from the ones that I have learned from. The first, his name is Alan Clements, and he's a ex-Burmese Buddhist monk. Ex because, he embarked on his own journey that was sort of unaligned to the lessons that he was learning in his particular temple. And also S.N. Goenka, a man who's no longer around, no longer alive today, but his teachings live on, and many also have learnt from this amazing man. There are various other monks that I have learnt from through physical interaction with them, but I don't know their names. I've just been blessed enough to come across them in my path of trying to figure out this thing, right? And for those that are listening to the audio, I mean my mind, my head, okay, what's going on, the monster that can live up there. And I live today pretty free, honestly, from anxiety. If the emotion of anxiety arises, right, stress, overwhelm, so that tension in the chest and the stomach and the throat, it starts dissipating quite quickly. Even if it's sitting there for a little bit, I'm very at peace with it. So it's something that I've learned over the last 2 to 3 years is this understanding that peace isn't something that I can just create, but it's something that I must enable, if you will. So in other words, rather than me trying to conquer anxiety to create peace, which is what I believed for so long, I didn't realize I was just creating more fight in my mind. And by trying to push away certain thoughts and certain feelings within myself, I was creating a rejection of my current reality in terms of how I was. And this is what many would call a lack of self-acceptance, without realizing that this was actually getting me further away from my goal of peace. It was when I came to the deeper understanding through more so the learning from the monk's side of things, that by meeting myself where I'm at, no matter how I'm feeling, no matter what's on my mind, and learning how to be more at peace with the way things are this moment, still understanding that I would like to change things and create a new outcome, but the current reality is this reality in terms of what I'm thinking and feeling. So if I can't accept and embrace the reality of the way things are right now, then how can I create a possible change? Because I'm in rejection of myself, which is creating more stress and getting me further away from peace. And if we look at the more neuroscience side of it, if I have a particular thought or feeling and I act in resistance to this experience, I'm going to trigger what's called my threat detection center, aka the amygdala, into higher activity. This triggers activity into the hypothalamus, which is a word that I still struggle with saying today, and the brainstem, which then triggers heightened activity of what we call the sympathetic nervous system, okay? So your more fight, flight nervous system, triggering secretion of adrenaline and cortisol. So in other words, we're heightening levels of stress in our brain and body by trying to reject a current experience because our brain's stimulating a pattern of threat detection in that scenario. So in learning more about this, I started to understand this what is anxiety question. Well, anxiety is a perception where my brain believes there is a threat when a threat isn't actually there. And that can be created by a belief in my mind of this is going to happen or what if this does. My brain then looks at that worst case scenario and goes, hell no, I do not want that to happen. And it does everything it can to avoid that. So in other words, these what are called default mode networks, which is another fancy word or phrase for conditioning, triggers. And I fall back into my old habits and old patterns, and I react to a scenario the way I've been conditioned. But if I want to create a new outcome, I need to learn how to respond to a scenario rather than fall into old reaction. And that's only going to happen when I can retrain my brain to experience safety in a situation where I would otherwise have experienced fear or some form of threat detection. And there are various methods to do this that I have learned. One in particular is an umbrella term called exposure therapy. Now, exposure therapy, not in the sense of just throwing myself into a scenario and just trying to get over it, right? Because that's never really sustainable. Because every time that wears off, I all of a sudden have to amp myself up again to throw myself into a scenario. But more so through exposing myself to a particular type of thought or a particular type of emotion, which is coming back to the more mindfulness side of things. And this is something that I've spent many years training in. And it's something that I've spent many years learning how to teach others to do the same. And I've worked with men over the last 4 years, dozens of them, who have successfully created patterns of safety where previously there were patterns of anxiety. Now, when safety is there, which is usually a middle point that gets missed in the pursuit of peace, right? So I've now reprogrammed myself to perceive a situation I believed was threatening as now safe. For example, my partner when she does a certain thing, or when I lose clients in business, or when my funds drop below a certain level, or when I'm in a social situation and someone is looking at me funny. I now no longer go into this threat detection state, this heightened activity of stress, and I can calmly and clearly deduce what I need to do in that moment. But that comes from that middle component, which is safety, right? And that's how I can experience more peace in those moments and think more clearly. One of my favorite metaphors for this, analogies, if you will, is something that I was trying to figure out, basically, and this sort of is how I came to it. I was trying to figure out how to explain two patterns to one of my clients in the past in terms of how we want to take someone from pattern A to pattern B, right? So pattern A being that threat detection, anxiety, stress, overwhelm, overthinking, to calm, collected, clear-minded. So how do we create that, right? Now, if you imagine someone was going to walk on a wet field, right? They walked a bunch of circles on that wet field. What's going to happen on that wet field? They're going to create a path. And the more they walk that wet field, the deeper and more ingrained that path's going to become. Now, that's pattern A. Now, they go to a second field. And on that second field is also a wet ground, and they continue to also walk those circles. Now they're creating patterns in a second field, in a second place. In other words, the neurons in the brain are starting to create new connections with other neurons, which is going to create a whole different and new experience when those particular patterns are stimulated or triggered. Now, this also means that sometimes, because the first pattern has already been deeply ingrained, if it's not used for a while, it still takes some time for that new pattern, that new ingrained, indented path on that first field to actually start to be grown over, it's going to take some time. Naturally, even when the second path is being treaded on constantly and the first path is not being touched. Now, that also means that the moment I hit a state of stress, my default kicks back in and I go back to that first field, that first pattern. This doesn't mean I've lost my progress on that second pattern of learning how to experience safety in the place of anxiety. It does, however, mean that I'm now re-strengthening for a moment that first path. But as long as I can learn how to shift myself out of that, I can get back onto the second field without creating too much more of that indent back on that first field, back in that first pattern. So in other words, how can I learn to experience more of that second pattern and live more in that second pattern than in that first pattern? And it's just learning how to firstly change my state at will, which takes a lot of practice, but is very possible. I mean, coming from a guy that literally lived in anxiety 24/7 at one point, to learning how to live more in that second field, right? So you can keep shifting back into it consistently, but in such a way, using therapies or modalities such as cognitive behavior therapy, where you can actually learn how to start experiencing those things more organically and naturally through the day, rather than it needing to be this constant reminder, such as an affirmation. Now, it's my hope that at least with that understanding of what is anxiety can actually help one to get a little bit more clarity around what's required to start creating progress in that direction, and then to not get into a state of hopelessness when one does fall back for a mere moment to that first pattern, that pattern of threat, fear, anxiety. That's going to happen. That's natural. That's life, right? Occasionally I get triggered back into those old patterns too. They don't ever completely die, but they become very dormant and they become experienced less. And if they do become experienced, the know-how of shifting back into that state of peace, that state of safety is so strong that it's only really moments that one lives for in terms of their experience in that first pattern, until eventually it just grows over fully, right? But there's still a little bit of ingrained stuff there. So it's just knowing that that can happen occasionally. But ultimately, by learning how to ingrain that second field as much as possible, over time that can become the new default, where that becomes the more organic way I live. So it's June, and starting the 1st of July, I'm going to run a program for men ages 25 to 35. This is mainly for Kiwis and Aussies out there, but others may also apply if it's interesting to you. There's a 12-step module that I run through over 10 months, and there's a guarantee that's attached to it. If this is of interest to you, of course, like no dramas if it's not, all right? This isn't me saying that you should do this and this is the only way. It's an option, which I believe, of course, based on the fact that this is purely the thing that worked for me so well and has worked for dozens of other men that I've successfully worked with. Of course, I'm going to be excited about sharing this, right? And it starts on the 1st of July. If you're interested in learning more, you can just head across to the link in the show notes right below. Just go there and find that little link, healingwithkiz.com/theprogram, and there'll be 12 modules there. Read through them, and that's how I take people through the program and achieve the results that they achieve, and achieve that reprogramming that I was just talking about. And the second thing I wanted to share really briefly is something that's very free, and I want to gift you. It's a opportunity to jump in on, if you're watching this before the 25th of June, that is on Sunday at 2 p.m. New Zealand Standard Time, I'm going to be running a free webinar for 60 minutes. I'm going to run over those steps that I run people through, and I'm going to offer practical, utilizable tools that will teach you how to create that state change so you can continue to get out of that first field, that first pattern, and also steps that you can start applying literally the day that you learn these, to start creating that second pattern, that second pathway, that pathway of safety in place of a pathway of anxiety and fear. And I really love, and I'd be honored for the opportunity to pass it on to you. You can register also in the link below. You must reserve your spot. It's not recorded, by the way. It's just 60 minutes, so it's literally 4% of your day on one day of this entire year, where you'll get to learn truly practical steps that you can start taking from someone that's had a true experience of living in anxiety and has successfully come out of that state, and also helped others to do the same. And I would love the opportunity to share that with you. So if that's of interest to you, you may reserve your spot. You must reserve your spot in order to access it. It's just the way the system works. And you'll get a link where you can access it from there. So when I started to understand this, what is anxiety and how do I start to create the change from it, or how do I reverse it? From understanding the things that I've explained to you in this audio or video, however you're digesting this, changed my life. And every action that I take for the sake of my well-being is in lieu with the information that I've just shared alongside creating that new pattern of safety more and more in a more established way in more components of my life. And I really pray that this has served you well in the way that it served me and many others. But with that being said, this is the end of the little snippet. It's great to be back in a different form, in a different way. I'm excited to share more. If this has been insightful for you, I'd really love to hear feedback. Like what stood out for you? Do you have any questions? Do you have any particular things you would like to talk about specifically? Whatever that might be, right? Whether it's my experience with the monks, or whether it's the things that I learned through biomedical science, whether it's a little bit more around what anxiety is and some practical steps that you could take to start shifting yourself out of that anxiety, how to reverse panic attacks. That's something I genuinely have experience with and also have taught others to do as well. There's so many things that I could talk about, but I'd love insight in terms of what you want specifically that would help me the most. So just leave it in the comments if you're on good old YouTube, all right? Otherwise, you can send, I think, a voice note through podcasts, which is pretty cool if you're on Spotify. And you can let me know there, or you can follow me on just find my YouTube and maybe message me there, right? Or Instagram is good as well, Coach Keza, all right? Coach Kezza. And I think that's about it. Otherwise, good old subscribe always goes a long way. Thank you so much once again. I'll see you next time. Lots of love.